So diglossia, as you know, is a language situation where more than one language varieties or more than one languages are used in a society in a very specific way. They're distributed in different functional domains, and the distribution is very strict. So in this presentation, we would learn about how the concept of diglossia initiated from Ferguson's paper and how it developed over time. So first of all, we have classical diglossia. It was not called classical diglossia in the initial stages, of course. It was just diglossia, but since it has developed so much since its inception, now we sometimes refer to it as a classical diglossia. Now, you are already familiar with this definition by Ferguson in his paper, which was published in 1959. He specifically mentioned a few languages where he said that there is a language situation which has a few characteristics. Like, first of all, it is stable, and there are at least two varieties where there is one very divergent and highly codified variety which has a very developed grammar, which has a text and etc., and it is superposed variety. That is, there are several dialects, and on each this variety is superposed, and this variety is used for literature, for formal communication, etc. And this variety by definition is not a mother tongue. It has to be learned by education, and it is not used for ordinary conversation. So these are the main points about diglossia, which one has to remember, because sometimes it seems like diglossia is just like another extension of a standard language versus dialect situation, but it is not. So these are the main things about diglossia that one has to remember. The varieties, which are referred to as H variety and L variety. H, that is the more formal variety, the variety that is used in formal situation. H is a short for high. So these two varieties are in complementary distribution all over the society. So everybody who is a competent speaker in that community would know where to use which variety, and one would not be used in place of other. If it does, if somebody uses a H variety in L situation or L variety in H situation, that would clearly indicate that this person is not a native speaker of the language. They do not know how to use the language. They may have learned the grammar and the vocabulary, but have not learned the use of language. And this is the thing, this is a hierarchical distribution. Okay, so one variety is on higher position, the other varieties are in lower position. And then, of course, this is most important. This is a stable situation. Diglossia is not a very dynamic situation. The examples that Ferguson used are of stable diglossic situation that have remained in same kind of complementary hierarchical distribution for centuries. And then the two varieties, the H and L varieties, they have distinction in different level of language. Not in the same degrees, but there is clear distinction that you can identify the two varieties very easily. They are not very similar. And then finally, this is a controversial one. These two are varieties of same language according to Ferguson, but there is a question about that. This concept, of course, has developed a lot later on, and now we also include genetically unrelated languages. But even in Ferguson's defining language, you will see that all languages are not really genetically related. So these are the defining languages: Arabic, Modern Greek, Swiss German, and Haitian Creole. We will see in the next slide that they are so different that these H and L varieties have different names for each other. So for example, for H Arabic variety, one of the names that are used to refer to that variety is Al-Fusha, and these are the different names for the low varieties. Similarly, for Swiss German, uh, Schriftsprache, which can be literally be translated as writing language, language for writing, and then dialect. And for Greek, we have these two names, the two terms, Katharevousa and Dimotiki. And for the other language, that is the Creole situation, we have Creole and Francais of French. So this is the point. This is not really genetically related. This is a Creole based on French, but we cannot call them really genetically related. So even in the defining languages by Ferguson, we have at least one example which are not genetically related varieties. So diglossia, as you know, is a language situation where more than one language varieties or more than one languages are used in a society in a very specific way. They're distributed in different functional domains, and the distribution is very strict. So in this presentation, we would learn about how the concept of diglossia initiated from Ferguson's paper and how it developed over time. Now, diglossia's features. The H variety has H functions, the L variety has L functions. A typical example of H functions would be literature, formal setting where you have a formal conversation, and typical example of L variety is home, where you're the language variety that you're using with your family, with your friends, etc. Then H variety usually is the only variety that has literary heritage, and it is the standard, it is the legitimate representation of that language. And sometimes you will see in editorial, etc., journalistic usage, there also you will see one can see that usage of H variety. Now, how the varieties are acquired? We have already mentioned that H variety is not acquired naturally. It has to be learned. It has to be done by school, or you may learn it from listening to the formal speech. But L variety is usually learned from your surrounding, either from adult to children and from children among themselves when they're communicating. So L variety is acquired from natural surrounding, H variety is not. Standardization. Of course, H is the standard variety. Its orthography is well established. Usually you will have a formal body which would determine the spelling, etc., the grammatical conventions, etc. They will have grammar books. They will have lexicons and dictionaries, etc. Usually for L varieties, there are hardly any descriptive studies. It's rare if there is at all any. Now, stability, as we have already mentioned, the diglossia by definition is a stable situation. H has grammatical categories, usually inflection system and more elaborate synonyms, etc., for nouns and verbs that are usually absent in L varieties. So H variety is the developed variety, something on which descriptive studies are done, something which is developed intentionally. So naturally it has a more elaborate and more complex grammatical system. Lexicon, here usually in all the cases the vocabulary is shared, but H has some terms for which L has no equivalent. L sometimes has some popular expression for which H has no equivalent, and there are cases where you can get synonymous pairs. For example, in the next slide you will see these are the doublets. So in Greek, Katharevousa Dimotiki has two different words for house. One is echo, the other is pity. Similarly, Arab, ma, a, both means what. In Creole, homme or genre, that is the French word for person, and for the Creole, maun, for the same meaning. Phonology, here in the defining languages, it is difficult to go have a general understanding about all the languages as a whole, because in Greek the cases, the varieties are quite close to each other. They do not have much differences as far as phonology is concerned. Then Arabic situation, the classical Arabic and the local varieties, and the hierarchical situation, that is French and Creole, they are slightly different. But Swiss German, the two varieties, the H and L, are strikingly different. So there's no general rule. So diglossia, as you know, is a language situation where more than one language varieties or more than one languages are used in a society in a very specific way. They're distributed in different functional domains, and the distribution is very strict. So in this presentation, we would learn about how the concept of diglossia initiated from Ferguson's paper and how it developed over time. Now, this is an important one because one must understand why diglossia has to be, why should we at all have a term for L and H situation? Because as competent speakers of language, we know that all languages have H language which are used in more formal situation, and all languages have L varieties which are used in informal situation. So what is difference? What is the difference between diglossia and dialects in standard situation? Before going into that, we will go into some other examples of diglossia other than those defining languages in Ferguson's paper. One example is of Tamil. Literary Tamil H variety is a very prestigious variety for centuries, and it has a large body of literature, and there are many naturally learned dialects. So this is one example of a diglossic situation. Then Latin and Romance language, for a part of time, Latin has the prestige language of charge, and it was the H variety, which is very different from the local Romance languages. Then there are some studies where Mandarin H and a standard L, okay, so that was considered a diglossic situation. But then again from diglossia they moved into standard with dialect situation. So standard with dialect situation is parallel to diglossia, but the main thing is that in standard with dialect situation, a segment of the community would use H in all situations. So the traditionally or situations that are considered L in diglossia, even in that situation, there is a section of the community which will use H. So H is actually a normally acquired, not learned language variety for a section of speakers. But it is not so in case of diglossia, because diglossia, H is nobody's mother tongue. Nobody can use H for conversing with the family or friends, right? So here that is the main difference. Okay, standard is used more naturally by a region or a social group. So here we come to another alternative notion of communities, language-based community. Traditionally, or at least according to one viewpoint, speech community, all through speech community there is only one H and one L. But diglossia community, it is possible that for one H you can have several L. We have already talked about the situation in the Arabic speaking countries, where there are several very diverse varieties of L, but they form one single community because of this common H. So in this clip you will see that a number of students are translating certain sentences and words in their own Arabic L language.
أنا صحيت النهاردة بدري جدا.
أنا فقت الصباح بكري بزاف. سوري أنا فقت الصباح بكري بزاف. أنا فقت الصباح بكري.
Okay, I hear it now.
أنا فقت اليوم كتير بكير.
فقت وين؟
فقت ما حدا حكى لي. أنا اليوم صحيت بكير.
أنا اليوم قمت بدري. دولاد.
ماريو.
بلاكار.
Are you serious?
ماريو. Like it's Mario.
ها بلاكار ماريو
حسين.
خزانة. كبر. جزمة.
سبرديلة صباط.
صباط.
Why are you making fun of
لا لأن هو قال الأشياء عبلة هيدا.
سبرديلة. اسبادري in French. اسبادري.
سبردين. نحن نقول سبردين. نحن نقول سبردين.
French colonization.
Like عسوز عادي. That's crazy.
إنه بتحكي شوز أو صرماي.
جوتي.
So I will send you the whole clip if you are interested to know all the words that they say and how they react to each other's language. But they form the same community because they have the same age variety. So diglossia, as you know, is a language situation where more than one language varieties or more than one languages are used in a society in a very specific way. They're distributed in different functional domains, and the distribution is very strict. So in this presentation we would learn about how the concept of diglossia initiated from Ferguson's paper and how it developed over time. Now we come to the extended diglossia. You've already read Fishman's paper on bilingualism with and without diglossia, and diglossia with and without bilingualism. So the main point of difference in Fishman's conception of diglossia from Ferguson's is that he's saying that diglossia can be extended to situations where the two varieties or the languages H and S can be unrelated languages, not necessarily the varieties of the same language, not even closely related languages, but they can be completely unrelated, distant languages. And secondly, there can be several codes, not just one L and one H. And Fishman also acknowledges the contribution of Gompers in the development of this conception of diglossia. So here, when you're talking about two different languages having the H and L status instead of two language varieties, then obviously comes what is the difference between bilingualism and diglossia. Now, bilingualism is traditionally considered a subject for psychologists and psycholinguists, something that Fishman lamented, that the societal aspect of bilingualism has been ignored. Now, bilingualism can also be social. It's not just about the individual. We know that we live in a society which is largely bilingual. We have knowledge of more than one languages, and most part of the world today is like that. And whereas traditional classification, diglossia is considered a subject of sociologists. So it's about the distribution of language varieties for different communication situations. Now, once you've made the distinction between diglossia and bilingualism, once a society has the knowledge of two languages in various degrees, there can be four possible situations. That is a situation that has both diglossia and bilingualism, then bilingualism but no diglossia, then diglossia but no bilingualism, and neither. So that's the fourth situation is a monolingual society. The first situation, bilingualism and diglossia, for that he gives an example of Paraguay, where Spanish and Guarani is a local language and Spanish is a colonial language. They have, according to Fishman, a nationwide diglossic situation. That is, Guarani is spoken in all the low situations, but whenever there is a high situation, high context, then Spanish is spoken. So this is a perfect example of bilingualism as well as diglossia. There are some other examples as well. For example, for Hebrew and Yiddish, Hebrew is the H language and Yiddish is the uh, L language for Jewish males, and Arabic world. The example that you've just seen, that Egyptian, Syrian, Lebanese, Iraqi, Moroccan. So all these Arabic varieties, they are all L varieties, and they have only one H variety with classical Arabic. So now bilingualism but no diglossia. So there are cases, and we are quite familiar with them, that where two languages exist in a society, but they are not distributed in a very complementary distribution way, like we have seen in other cases of diglossia. That is, H language sometimes goes into the traditional domains of L language. So if you are speaking, suppose in a society, the H language is English and the L language is the local language. If H language is spoken in traditional L domains, like in friendship or in family, so that is a case of bilingualism without diglossia. So there is no stable distribution of the H and L varieties, but one is spoken in case of the other. So Fishman calls it leaky diglossia, where H is leaking into the domains of the traditional L language. Now, diglossia without bilingualism. Now, this is possible in a very segregated society where there is no interaction between two sections of people. Like the masses, they are speaking all the local languages, and those are the L languages, and the elites, they are speaking the H language, and the two never interact. So there is no question of bilingualism. They do not have to talk to each other, so they don't have to be bilingual, and they are just restricted to their own domains. They're speaking H, and the mass is speaking the L. Now, the final possibility, that is neither diglossia or nor bilingualism, is a completely monolingual society, which is quite unimaginable in a modern world, but perhaps it can exist in small, isolated and undifferentiated speech community. As we know that it is very unlikely in today's world that there is completely monolingual without any varieties, no H, no L, and no diglossia, no bilingualism. That is a very rare thing in modern world. So this is the summary. Now we can see that there's a difference between Ferguson's concept and Fishman's extended concept. These are variously termed. We have used the classical and extended diglossia for our presentation, but sometimes it is also called in diglossia and out diglossia, endodiglossia, exodiglossia, and narrow diglossia and broad diglossia. So diglossia, as you know, is a language situation where more than one language varieties or more than one languages are used in a society in a very specific way. They're distributed in different functional domains, and the distribution is very strict. So in this presentation, we would learn about how the concept of diglossia initiated from Ferguson's paper and how it developed over time. Now, even after Fishman's concept, the concept of diglossia has been studied variously. For example, depending on the relationship between H and L, there can be various different types of diglossia. For example, in classical examples like the defining languages, in Arabic, Greek, etc., the H language is a classical language and L is a vernacular, and the two are related. But there can be another situation where H is classical and L is vernacular, but the two is not related, like the textual Hebrew or Aramaic and Yiddish. Then there can be another possibility where H is written and formal spoken and L is vernacular, and the two is related, like as in Spanish, two is unrelated, sorry, as in Spanish and Guarani situation in Paraguay. And another possibility is H is written for and formal spoken, and L is vernacular, and the two is genetically related, as in High German, Swiss German. Okay. Now, there can be various other situations where the concept of diglossia can be used. For example, in Tanzania, the study showed that there is after independence, Swahili was declared the national language, and it got some kind of status. Though as a English colony, English also has a high status, so it's somewhat similar to us in that respect. But what happened is that when local schools adopted Swahili for the medium of instruction, so all the children that went to school adopted Swahili as their H language. So all the formal domains and all the H domains, for that Swahili was used. But for all the L domains, like speaking with the family, etc., the vernacular languages were used. Now, when they went to higher education, there were very few institutes, and they had to leave their hometown to go to cities to get the higher education, and all the educational classes or the lectures, they were conducted in English. So English becomes the H language there. All the academic communication happened in English, but when they talked among themselves, the students, or locally for markets, etc., so for those things they used Swahili. So Swahili here becomes the L language, and then again when they went back home, Swahili becomes the H language. Vernaculars are the low languages. So the status of Swahili and English and vernacular, they just change with the context as H and L language. So this is called the double overlapping diglossia. I hope you have already read Fassel's book and the chapter on diglossia. You will find a similar this example over there. Another example, which was taken from Gumper's study in Khalapur, which is close to Delhi. Here, Khalapur, there is a language which is called Khalapuri. Okay, then Khalapuri had two varieties, which is Khalapur is can maybe considered a variety of Hindi. So this Khalapuri is very distinct from Hindi though, and it had two varieties. One is Moti Boli, another is Saf Boli. So Moti Boli is the language, the low variety, the low family language, the French domain language. So this is all spoken. They all among themselves they spoke Moti Boli. And when there is a guest, somebody came to visit them, they switched to Saf Boli, which is Saf version. It's a more elite version of their language. Now, when somebody from outside the community comes, they shift to Hindi, conversational Hindi. And when the lecture happens in a formal setting, they shift to oratorial or the Sanskritized Hindi. So there is our overall distinction between Hindi and Khalapuri as H and L, and even between Khalapur there is a Moti Boli and Saf Boli, there is one H and L, and in Hindi there is Sanskritized Hindi and conversational Hindi. So there is another H and L. So this is called a double nesting diglossia. Now finally so this is the final example of another application of the whole concept of diglossia, which is what we are calling linear polyglossia, and it is as we have seen it in the Chinese community of Malaysia. As you probably know that Malaysia has three major communities, language-based communities that is. One is Malay, the second is Chinese, the third is the Indian community. Now, in Malaysia, Bahasa Malaysia is or Bahasa Melayu, it's sometimes called. It has official status, and it is often referred to as a national language. So it has some status. But again, like us, their English has a very very prestigious status. It is used in all professional settings. So there are two H languages. One is formal Malaysian English, and the second is Bahasa Malaysia. Then there is, for Chinese communities, Mandarin, which is the standard Chinese, has a special place. However, it is never used in any context. There is hardly any domain dedicated to that language. So, but it has a high status. So, it is called the dummy high. Then we have two middle varieties. One is colloquial Malaysian English, which is different from formal Malaysian English. It's a variety. And then dominant Chinese language. Then locally dominant Chinese language, that becomes the M2. Then L has several, there are several L's. Native Chinese language, that is the language that is probably they may call it mother tongue or something like that. So for that community, the native Chinese language is their L1. Then there are several other Chinese languages. You know, the Chinese language has several varieties. So L2 to Ln, there can be these many L varieties. And then finally there is another L, which is Bajar Malay. It's a pidgin language. It's a lingua franca. So there are so many different distributional, complementary distributional languages. And even here, the concept of diglossia is very useful in explaining how according to the usage, we can see how language is spread out through the society. So the whole concept of diglossia, from where it started to how it is useful in today's society, in multilingual societies, or even in societies where there are one language is several varieties. This whole concept is very, very useful when we are studying different socio-linguistic situation around us. So what you can do is to see whether the situation that you are in Calcutta or in different parts of India, whether the multilingual situation has some diglossic distribution, or is it a simple bilingual situation, or is there something else like the double-nested diglossia, polyglossia, or is there something else? So diglossia, as you know, is a language situation where more than one language varieties or more than one languages are used in a society in a very specific way. They're distributed in different functional domains, and the distribution is very strict. So in this presentation, we would learn about how the concept of diglossia initiated from Ferguson's paper and how it developed over time.